May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. My heart is breaking as I write my first draft of this sermon. Another violent tragedy hits our country with a gaspable kick in the stomach. Then another with the brutal murders of 2 people in Frewsburg, and another with the plant explosions in West Texas. Then for some of us comes the violence in the Senate, in the inexplicable banning of background checks for gun buyers. Can we take any more? Miguel writes in his blog, "The world feels like it is breaking." We are at a breaking point, and it feels like the only thing we have control over is to numb ourselves from all the bad news, tune out, drink, take an anxiety pill, smoke a little dope, or go shopping. And yet, as citizens of God's kingdom, we have to care. These are our brothers and sisters in God, even the 2 Tsarnyevs, who seem to have lost all conscience when they bombed the Boston Marathon. But the only way we can care is if we can somehow find the good news in all of this. And it begins to roll in, to show itself as God's love when you're looking for it. Some of the marathon runners who get word of the bombings while they're still en route continue running. After they have finished, still short of the finish line, run another 2 miles to Mass General Hospital to give blood, after they've already run 26 miles. A man throws himself on top of another man who is shielding his son just next to one of the bombs. Still others, countless others, so many more than have committed all of these atrocious acts combined, run toward the explosions instead of running for their lives. Later, thousands of law enforcement and emergency responders will risk their lives to keep people safe. It is their only objective, keeping people safe, not their own glory, not saving themselves first. Later, someone will post a picture of one of the victims, 8-year-old Martin Richard, who had made a poster recently that said very presciently, "No more hurting people, peace." How Christ-like. On Facebook, amidst the anger and demands for vengeance for the bombings, others began to find ways to celebrate the good nature of so many more people. Actor Patton Oswalt posted a much-needed love letter to Boston and the country, which said, "When you spot violence or bigotry or intolerance or fear or just garden variety misogyny, hatred, or ignorance, just look it in the eye and say, 'The good outnumber you and always will.'" A 9-year-old boy who goes by the name Kid President and who has gone viral on the internet tweets, "Sad after a long week, but there will always be more awesome than awful, always." And also on Twitter, people by the hundreds start tweeting with the hashtags, "Pray for your enemies," and "Pray for our enemies." I'm uplifted and moved. Mourning turns to dancing. As the church, we need to be saying all this. By the church, I mean you. We, as people of the resurrection, citizens of God's kingdom, have got to be out there in the lead, put our own impatience aside, our own judgments, our own desire for swift vigilante justice aside, so that we can look for and proclaim the resurrected Christ in the midst of all this brokenness. If we don't do it, what hope is there for the world? Who can possibly change it? In today's gospel, Jesus says, "What the Father has given me is greater than all these, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand." Either we believe we are in the Father's hand or we don't. This is one of the few occasions where all or nothing thinking is appropriate. A former AA sponsor of mine used to remind me of this every time I would think something seemed too hopeless to pray for, or even too trivial. God is everything or God is nothing, she would say, and I would scramble to wrap my mind around that. Jesus also says in today's gospel, on this Good Shepherd Sunday, that my sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. We are those sheep, folks. We are the sheep and lambs that Jesus asked Peter and anyone who loves Jesus to feed. And we are in need of some feeding right now. Oh, sure, there are people who have lost their loved ones in the bombings, in the explosions in Texas, in the shootings in Frewsburg. They may have more immediate needs, but it doesn't mean that God's sheep in this other world not of God's creating don't also need some feeding. God can take care of it all with the help of us sheep. Next, we need to be about feeding. So what can we possibly do? Where do we start? Many spiritual leaders, much wiser than I, would say that we have to start with ourselves and our own inner violence. But I'm afraid that this advice has given birth to a whole generation of people who put off doing anything until they could get their own acts together. 30 years of therapy and self-help groups and thousands of books later, they're ready to retire and start doing something. I think we can multitask here. We can be aware of our own violent thoughts and anger and desire for getting all the wrongs we have suffered right, and we can do something. Episcopal Relief and Development has been in touch with the diocese most affected by the disasters, and they say what they need now more than anything is prayer. Prayer for the families of those who died. Prayer for the children who witnessed the atrocities. Later, ERD will be in touch with us as churches for financial support. We can also rally and work for peace and assault weapons control and mental illness treatment and tolerance in our schools. Pick just one thing. It's all you can do. But we must do something or remain numb. My main concern right now is intolerance and bullying in our culture. Unfettered, uncensored hatred is being expressed in our living rooms, behind closed doors, and through social media and anonymous discussion boards on the internet. More of us need to have the courage to care enough to speak up and speak out when we see and hear intolerance and bigotry being expressed, when someone is being bullied, even if they aren't there. What does all this have to do with the events of this week? Maybe nothing. One of the bombers was apparently very popular, but maybe he participated in bullying enough to develop a calloused indifference toward his fellow human beings. I believe that bullying is at an epidemic level in our country. Recently, as some of you know, Jamestown Public Schools has been surveying our junior and senior high kids about their experience of bullying in every class all day. The other thing I think we need to look at as a culture is how easily we are offended or feel our rights are violated. This too is at an epidemic level in our country. This does not mean that there aren't some groups in our country whose rights are being violated. Well, we can't all be victims. Some of us have to be gracious enough to say, yes, we've been wrong not to treat you as human beings who have the same rights as the majority of us have. I'm willing to compromise and share my freedom with you. There's a lot of defensiveness and knee-jerk reacting to minorities who are asking for the same rights the majority have enjoyed for centuries now. Ask yourself what you're afraid of, And if it's a legitimate fear, try talking it out with someone in that minority group. Try telling them in person that you don't think they deserve what you have. It gets even harder when you remember that they are children of God as well. One of these fears surfaced during the identification and eventual tracking of the bombing suspects. Chris Matthews on uber-liberal MSNBC said, "No normal American could have done something like this. It has to be someone influenced by foreign terrorists." This may turn out to be true, but as children of God, as people who love Jesus enough to feed all of his sheep, we have to be loving enough to pray for our enemies and not seek for revenge. When Peter cut off the ear of the soldier who came to arrest Jesus in the garden, Jesus demanded enough of this. Jesus forgave everyone who killed him. Jesus came back from the grave to remind all of us to love the way he loved, completely, recklessly, and without consideration of worthiness. If you paid attention, though, to the gospel, you also heard Jesus say, "But you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep." He's telling them this because they're demanding that he tell them if he is the Messiah or not, so that they can arrest him for blasphemy. He has told them through parables and miracles and healing, but they want him to be the kind of Messiah who is going to overthrow the Roman Empire, and they are not satisfied. There are people who do not believe in Jesus and do not follow his way. There are many people who have fallen away from the church, others who follow other paths to God. Still others, Muslim and Christian, who distort the message of their faith traditions to such a degree that they use the Quran and the Bible to justify their own extreme acts of violence. This is not an excuse for us to abandon Jesus' teachings, an example to seek vengeance for their actions. More than anything, we need to follow Jesus' teachings of compassion by praying for our enemies and stopping the violence, starting with us. As 8-year-old Martin said, "No more hurting people, peace." Jesus couldn't have said it any better.
Jesus, our mighty Lord, our strength in sadness, the Father's conquering work, true source of gladness. Your name we glorify, O Jesus, throned on high. You gave yourself to die for our sins.